Breaking news tonight as a new move from Donald Trump sends a shock through millions of Americans who rely on dividend income. Listen carefully because what I'm about to tell you affects your money, your retirement, and your financial future in a way most people will not understand until it's too late. A sudden shift in policy is now targeting dividend checks, and early documents reveal that only a limited group of Americans may still be eligible under the revised framework. If you count on quarterly payouts, depend on dividend-producing investments, or expect any type of distribution this year, you need to hear this update from start to finish. Trump has quietly pushed forward a change that alters how dividend checks are classified and who actually qualifies to receive them. And even though this sounds like a routine financial adjustment, it's anything but routine. The new rules shrink the eligibility pool dramatically and not for the reasons you might expect. This isn't about stock market performance. It isn't about company profits, and it isn't about whether your investment did well or not. It's about a sudden change in how the federal government decides who counts as an eligible dividend recipient. Most people have no idea this is happening yet. Brokers aren't announcing it. Financial advisors are waiting for final guidance. And the statements going out next month may look very different from what you're used to seeing. But if you're watching this right now, you are already ahead of millions of Americans who will wake up confused when their dividend amount is lower, delayed, or missing entirely. So, what exactly changed? Why now? And why is the eligible group so small? The truth is buried deep inside a new executive order that calls for a full review of dividend classifications, verification requirements, and beneficiary rules. And while the official explanation sounds simple, the real-world consequences are huge. Only a narrow slice of Americans will continue qualifying under the initial guidelines, and that number could shrink even more in the coming months. If you're thinking this might only affect wealthy investors, think again. The group impacted the most includes middle-income retirees, long-term savers, and everyday investors who use dividends to supplement Social Security checks, cover rising bills, or simply keep up with inflation. These are the people now caught in the crossfire of a policy shift that appeared out of nowhere. Now, here's where things get even more concerning. The new criteria aren't based solely on income or account size. They involve residency verification, tax reporting consistency, and a new tiered eligibility system that analysts say will filter out a significant portion of current dividend recipients. In other words, qualifying isn't automatic anymore. You might have to prove eligibility in ways that were never required before. Before you get too alarmed, understand that this is just the beginning of the story. The internal memos mention a phased rollout, meaning this isn't a one-time change. It's the start of a larger restructuring that could reshape how dividends are distributed in the United States. And the part that will shock most people is still ahead. So stay with me. I'm going to break down exactly what triggered this move, what the administration is saying behind closed doors, and how this could impact your next payout. What happens next will surprise you. In order to understand why this change matters so much, you need to know the context behind it. Dividend checks have always been one of the most stable ways Americans build long-term financial security. Retirees depend on them. Middle-income families use them as a safety net. Even younger investors rely on them as a predictable source of passive income. For decades, the system barely changed. Companies paid out dividends, investors received them, and the IRS handled the tax side. Simple, predictable, familiar. But over the past 2 years, concerns started growing inside both the Treasury Department and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Analysts flagged unusual spikes in dividend distributions going to accounts that didn't match typical U.S. residency patterns. A report quietly circulated last fall suggested that billions of dollars in dividend-related payouts might have been routed through structures that bypassed standard verification rules. And when those findings reached Trump's economic advisors, everything accelerated. That's when the idea of reviewing the entire dividend classification system appeared. According to people familiar with the discussions, this wasn't supposed to be public yet. It began as a technical audit, something handled internally. between the Treasury, the SEC, and the IRS. But the more they uncovered, the more pressure built to intervene quickly. By the time the executive order was drafted, the focus had shifted from routine oversight to a full-scale restructuring of who actually qualifies for dividend payouts under federal guidelines. And that's the part most Americans never hear about. The public explanation is framed around closing loopholes and strengthening financial security. But behind the scenes, the conversations are very different. Advisors worried that foreign entities and high-volume trading operations were quietly exploiting dividend timing rules. Some warned that if the issue wasn't addressed immediately, the tax system could face billions in lost revenue over the next decade. But here's the twist. While the review was meant to target large financial players, the ripple effects now hit everyday Americans the hardest. You're not hearing that on traditional news outlets. You're not seeing it on your brokerage dashboard, but the shift is happening anyway. Internal notes from mid-year briefings describe how a new tiered eligibility framework would work. Instead of treating every dividend recipient the same, the government would begin separating them into smaller categories based on verification status, income history, tax alignment, and investment type. That means not all dividends are treated equally anymore, and not all dividend recipients are considered eligible in the same way. This is where confusion starts. Investors who have received the same dividend for 10, 20, or even 30 years might suddenly be flagged for review. People who rely on dividends to fill the gap between Social Security payments could be placed into a lower priority tier without ever being notified directly. And brokers are still waiting for instructions on how to communicate these changes to their clients. Now, why does all this matter? Because the moment classifications change, the payouts change. And the moment payouts change, household budgets get squeezed. A retiree counting on a $400 quarterly dividend may only receive $260. Someone who built a dividend portfolio to support rising medical or housing costs might see the numbers drop overnight. And younger investors who reinvest dividends to grow long-term wealth will feel the impact through slower compounding. But here's the truth. We are only in the early phase. The Treasury is still drafting the final language. The SEC is preparing its official guidance, and the White House has signaled there could be even more revisions depending on what the internal audit uncovers. Before you get too frustrated or overwhelmed, remember this. Understanding the rules early gives you a major advantage. Millions of Americans won't even realize they're affected until their payout arrives short. But you now know exactly where the pressure began, how fast the restructuring is moving, and why the eligibility pool is shrinking, who still qualifies, who gets pushed out, and what you need to check immediately in your own accounts. This is where the real impact shows up, and it's the part no one can afford to ignore. Now, let's break down the part every American wants to know. Who still qualifies? Who gets pushed out, and what these changes actually mean for your money? Because once the Treasury's tiered eligibility model kicks in, not everyone receiving dividends today will continue receiving them tomorrow. And the difference between being eligible and being excluded could come down to details you've never had to think about before. The first group that still qualifies under the initial guidance is what officials are calling verified domestic holders. These are investors whose residency status, tax information, and account activity line up perfectly with what the IRS has on file. If you filed consistently, your income ranges match your investment records, and your brokerage account is fully documented, you're likely in this category. But here's the catch. Even inside this group, payouts could change. Amounts may shift based on new reporting requirements, withholding adjustments, and dividend classifications that are still being finalized. The second group includes long-term holders with uninterrupted dividend histories. These are people who have owned the same dividend-producing assets for many years, sometimes decades. On paper, they should be the safest group, but analysts warn that even they might face a temporary review phase, especially if their income level changed significantly in the last 2 tax cycles. A retiree who stopped working, for example, might suddenly fall into a review bracket simply because their tax profile looks different today than it did 2 years ago. Now, let's talk about the people most at risk of losing eligibility, and this is where the new rules hit the hardest. The group facing the biggest cuts includes middle income investors who rely on dividends to fill financial gaps, retirees supplementing their Social Security checks, families covering rising housing or medical costs, and everyday investors reinvesting dividends for long term growth. These people were never the target of the review. Yet, they are the ones being squeezed by the tightening guidelines. Why? Because under the new system, matching your tax records, confirming your residency status, and meeting updated verification rules aren't just formality, they're mandatory. If anything looks inconsistent, an address change, a missing tax document, an income drop, or an account mismatch, your dividend could be flagged, reduced, or withheld. You might still technically qualify, but your payout won't be released until additional proof is submitted. And brokers warn that processing times could stretch for weeks. Another affected group includes investors who receive dividends through custodial or pooled accounts. Under the new model, these accounts must now provide clearer beneficiary details. If the brokerage can't verify the end recipient quickly, the account gets moved to a lower eligibility tier. That means smaller payouts or delays until verification is complete. For millions of families using joint accounts or custodial accounts for minors, this could become a real issue. Let's bring this down to real-life examples so you can picture the impact clearly. Imagine a retiree in Arizona who relies on a $320 quarterly dividend to cover medication costs. Under the new tiered system, her account might be reviewed simply because her tax status changed after she stopped working. That review could reduce her next payout by more than 30%. Or consider a middle income investor in Ohio who built a modest dividend portfolio over 15 years. His payouts could be delayed because his residency record doesn't match the mailing address on file after a recent move. Meanwhile, a smaller and more fortunate group will continue receiving full dividend checks with little to no disruption. These include high verification investors with stable tax histories, consistent residency documentation, and accounts that align perfectly with the new standards. They represent a much smaller slice of the population, but they're the ones the system currently favors. Before you get too discouraged, let me tell you something important. There is an overlooked loophole inside the early guidelines. And while officials haven't talked about it publicly, financial analysts have already noticed it. If your account meets the upcoming documentation requirements before the verification phase begins, you can lock in your eligibility earlier than most Americans. Brokers are not actively advertising this, but internal memos suggest that early verification will move your account into a protected tier once the final rules take effect. But how long will that window stay open? No one knows yet, and experts warn it may close as soon as the Treasury releases its updated compliance timeline. That means taking action sooner rather than later could make a meaningful difference in whether your dividend checks remain unchanged or drop without warning. The bigger question now is what happens next. And that's where things get even more complicated. Internal projections show that this dividend restructuring may trigger a wave of market adjustments, tighter reporting from financial institutions, and potentially more rules rolling out later this year. And the people who understand these changes early, people like you, will be in a far better position to protect their payouts than those who find out after their check shrinks. Now that you understand who still qualifies and who's being pushed out, let's talk about what you should do right now to protect yourself. Because even though the rules are tightening, you are not powerless. In fact, the next few steps could determine whether your dividend checks stay intact or get caught in the new eligibility filters. The first thing you should check is your most recent brokerage statement. Look for any notes about account verification, updates to dividend classifications, or changes in withholding. Most people skip over this section, but this is exactly where brokers will insert early warnings. If something looks unfamiliar or a term appears that you haven't seen before, that's your signal that the new rules are already being applied behind the scenes. Next, confirm that the income on your last two tax returns matches the information your brokerage has on file. A surprising number of investors get flagged simply because their income category changed after retirement or because a W 2 or 1099 is missing from the brokerage's verification system. When the Treasury's new guidelines kick in, any mismatch, even a small one, can delay or reduce your payment. Fixing these issues now puts you ahead of millions who won't act until it's too late. You should also verify your residency status, especially if you've moved within the last 2 or 3 years. A new address that hasn't been updated with the IRS or your brokerage can automatically shift your account into a lower eligibility tier. Even something as simple as a different ZIP code on two separate documents can trigger a review. Make sure every piece of information lines up. Consistency is what the new system is designed to reward. Another critical step is checking for any pending notifications from your brokerage. Firms like Fidelity, Schwab, Vanguard, Merrill, and Robinhood have begun preparing internal messages to alert customers about new verification phases. Some of these alerts won't be sent by email. They'll appear inside your online account under the Message Center. This is where most people never look, but this is exactly where the early warning signals will be posted. If you're part of a joint account, a custodial account, or an account that distributes dividends to more than one family member, you need to make sure all beneficiaries are verified. Under the new rules, if even one person is missing documentation, the entire account can be downgraded. This is one of the most common issues analysts expect to see, especially for households managing shared financial resources. Now, let's talk about peace of mind because that matters too. A lot of viewers are worried right now. They're seeing dramatic headlines, hearing confusing messages, and wondering if their financial future is suddenly unstable. But let me reassure you, staying informed is the greatest advantage you can have. These changes may be complicated, but they are not impossible to navigate. Knowing the rules early gives you control. Acting early protects your payout, and paying attention puts you ahead of most Americans who won't prepare. The truth is, this restructuring isn't finished yet. More changes could be announced. Additional eligibility tiers might be added. Verification rules could tighten further. And analysts believe the next round of updates may be even bigger than what we've seen so far. But here's the good news. You don't have to face any of this alone. As each phase rolls out, I'll be here breaking everything down in simple, clear language so you're never blindsided. So here's what I want you to do. Stay alert, check your documents, keep your information consistent, and if you start seeing anything unusual in your dividend statements, don't ignore it. That's your early sign that the system is shifting again. And before you go, make sure you subscribe to this channel because the next few weeks will be critical. The updates coming next could affect your wallet, your retirement income, and your financial stability more than any dividend change we've seen in years. You deserve clarity, you deserve honest explanations, and you deserve someone looking out for you in a confusing financial moment. Stay informed, stay prepared, and remember, you're never facing these changes alone. I'll keep you updated every step of the way.